You're listening to the MindPod Network. Friends, lovers, and listeners, please support the It's All Happening podcast by heading over to iTunes and leaving this podcast a review, or using the Amazon portal at zachleary.com to buy lots of stuff. It's all happening. 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 It's all Hello, my friends. Welcome to the podcast. It's All Happening with Zach Leary. That's me, your host. This is episode 121 of the show. This week on the podcast, we have comedian Shane Mauss, who dropped by to discuss his life, his comedy, and his new movie, Psychonautics, which is about his adventure into the inner depths and the inner workings of personal explorations with psychoactive substances. We'll talk more about that in a second, but Shane is really a fantastic voice and a very, very funny person. And he's just one of those guys, stand-up comedy these days. I mean, some could argue it's been this way for quite a while. I mean, George Carlin, you can certainly say this about, but in a lot of ways, the comedians of today are really the philosophers of our time. Yes, they are funny. Yes, they are up there doing a routine and an act, but they are also taking the issues that define us and the issues that make up our culture and our society and are dissecting them on stage in real time and sort of working out the implications of these issues in a very, very comedic way. And Shane I think, fits into that category for certain. He is a part philosopher and comedian. So before we get into the podcast with Shane, we are going to talk about a story that has just broke in the news. This is an It's All Happening public service announcement. It's been a while since we've talked about politics on this podcast, and I know a lot of us got burned out after the 2016 election cycle, and I swore to myself that we would never talk about politics as frequently as we did then. Nonetheless, this week, the major story in the news cycle, the retirement of Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, warrants a discussion about our participation in the civic voting process. This will be the second Supreme Court justice that Trump has put on the bench in his very, very short term, and this one is so consequential that it can shift the bench to a very, very far-right conservative makeup for a generation or two. This could mean the overturning of Roe versus Wade, the continuing destruction of minority and immigrant rights, the continuing destruction of minority voting rights, the continuation and evolution and expansion of policies like Citizen United, which gives powers to corporations and not individuals. This single issue is the embodiment of an example of why we need to vote. This is the difference. As bad as the other choice was, it wasn't this bad. It wasn't going to put in place somebody who would make minorities and homosexuals and women the target of the agenda of old white men. This has been an It's All Happening public service announcement. All right, I know that had nothing to do with the warm and fuzzy world of psychedelic research, but it had to be said. Shane Mauss on the podcast. He is a very, very funny man. He has his own podcast called Here We Are, as he interviews scientists about the meaning of life. It's really, really, really a great show. And you could see Shane in a town near you as his continuing A Good Trip tour roams around the country, where he spreads his brand of wisdom and comedy. But we talked a lot about his new film called Psychonautics, which is, I had the pleasure of seeing it. The film is not out yet, but stay tuned on information about where you can see it. Wikipedia defines psychonautics as the exploration of the psyche by means of techniques such as lucid dreaming, brainwave entertainment, sensory deprivation, and the use of hallucinogens or ethnogens. So in this film, Shane takes a deep personal dive into the world of psychedelics, his use of them, his transformation, his speed bumps along the way, and all the glory, wisdom, and expansion that he experienced. So keep an eye out for the movie. Go to ShaneMauss.com, and that's MAUSS.com, and keep up with everything that Shane is doing. I'm so grateful he came by to do this, and enjoy the show.
I wanted to prove that psychedelics are not as scary as they seem. So I did all of them. And so I just got out of a psych ward. Humans have been doing psychedelics forever. This is the least amount of psychedelic use in human history.
Shane, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for having me.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
I think the Greeks start off like weddings and ceremonies with breaking plates into the fire. So spilling a little coffee. It's like, yes.
Yeah.
Mazel tov.
I walked in, got a coffee, and spilt it all over your white couch.
Just a little bit.
It's just a power move that I do. What I do. Yeah, exactly. What I do. If for any listeners that are thinking of inviting me into their home, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna show up. I'm gonna demand a beverage, and then I'm going to spill it. Oh, I'm going to take a look around for the most absorbent and contrasting color to that beverage in your house, and then I'm going to spill it all over. Make it look like an accident, of course. I mean, I'm not going to be a total dick about it. I'm going to pretend like it was by accident, and then, you know, your move. You know, I just established myself as the alpha.
It's like the Rick James True Hollywood Story. Remember the Dave Chappelle?
But what specifically?
Rick James goes and he dirties up the couch. Remember Eddie Murphy's couch or something? Oh, and he's rubbing his boots all over the couch. They should have never given you money. Soil your couch, motherfucker. So funny.
So I just pulled some Rick James shit.
I love it. Classic. You good? You been well?
Yeah. Other than a case of the old spillsies, I've been good. Things have been interesting and exciting and uncertain and all sorts of
the good things. All the
things, I guess.
Congratulations on the movie.
Thanks.
So I wanted to start off with that with you called it Psychonautics.
Yeah, that was like we weren't sure what the.
I love that though.
Yeah.
My dad used to have this rule that if you make up words, but you know what they mean.
Yeah.
If you can look at the made-up word and still know what it means, then it's okay.
Yeah.
And you kind of made it up, and it's awesome.
Well, I mean, I think I've heard other people use the word psychonaut before.
Well, but yeah, psychonautics.
Right.
Psychonaut is what the person said. I love that, though.
Yeah, it was coming up with. there were a few things that were like really unexpectedly fun of kind of like the work of putting so like having the poster made was a lot of fun. Like getting to commission a piece of art and come up with the idea of what we wanted it to be was lots of fun.
So cool.
And same with animation, which we're going to add more to. The name, however, was like, I didn't enjoy that process. It was hard. I was not happy with the many, and we weren't sure what the film was at first. At first it was going to be called So You're Thinking About Tripping. It was almost going to be like more of a tutorial. We didn't know what the film was until I lost my mind, and then we were like, oh, okay, we have an idea what the film is.
Until you lost your mind, you did the 7 days in the institution.
Yeah.
Was that, how far into the process was the institution visit?
I was right at the end. We were still like, what is this movie? Like, we have all this great footage. And what actually happened, we kind of cheated in the film. We kind of show a scene of me being like, oh, I'm going to do a clandestine ayahuasca ceremony. But that was shot later on. What actually happened was I went to do ayahuasca to get ready to do ayahuasca on film.
You need
to like prepare
some pre-production
ayahuasca because I'd only done ayahuasca 2 other times, and it was like really mild, and I wanted to have like a full experience before, so I kind of knew what to, because we were on such a low budget and everything else, and I also for personal reasons I wanted to do, because I did ketamine for the first time on film, but it was like, so I didn't feel like I really grasped the whole of like what the experience would have been about, because like we were filming, and it's just like, okay, I want to make sure I'm not drooling, and like, you know, there's all these things that you can't help but like happening. And so I just wanted like a normal, no camera ayahuasca experience under my belt before going. And we were having trouble finding like someone to do it on camera with me. Like, we checked a few places that do ceremonies, and then it's like, to get other people to sign off on it. So anyhow, went to do ayahuasca, ended up losing my mind. And so then we just had to like tell the story of what happened. Like at first the producer and director were freaking out because like I went off the grid for a little while, and then like they get a call from me, and I'm in a psych ward, and then when I did talk to him, I was like deeply paranoid, like it was like a Truman Show-ish kind of thing. So I was like accusing them of like, what is this? Is this like, are you guys setting me up? And like I was really, really in the midst of some pretty severe paranoia. And but then after things settled down and I had time to integrate, I wasn't worried about like being permanently
fried.
Permanently fried. No, I never was. Other people were worried for me, but I was like, I was still in there.
Yeah.
I just couldn't help, but it was like the fear and the paranoia are just such strong motivators that my logical side that would be like, well, no, this is just statistically not a reasonable thing to think, would be overtaken by the fear and the paranoia.
And it's like what you in the bit that you do on stage, and that's also in the movie about like if you're drunk, thinking that like, oh my God, this isn't gonna last forever. Be without my pants forever.
Right.
You know that.
Right.
This has an ending.
Yeah.
Right? But comedic or comic relief aside, what I am curious about is, you're in deep in this process. You really, went in head first on the psychonautic principles. But going to the short little visit, the 7 days in the institution, like what What was your takeaway from that? I don't want to say what went wrong, because I don't like to imply that anything went wrong. That's not the words I like to use. But what happened? What happened?
Well, I mean, it was an eye opener for, what an experience like this is like, that a lot of people go through in life, because what was triggered for me by just a ridiculous. I mean, what we didn't show in the documentary was all of the psychedelics that I was doing, not on camera, like getting in the headspace for trying to articulate what this, these worlds are like, what this feeling is, Sure. And so, but what I unlocked was stuff that many people are going through on the natch, and so it was really a big,
brought it to the surface.
Yeah, and so it was like a real interesting insight into what psychosis feels like, what mania feels like. I remember walking past, some schizophrenic people on the street and overhearing them, and all of a sudden what they were saying made absolute sense to me, made perfect sense to me, and it wouldn't have normally. And being in the so the problem is that, because I've been to jail before, and
me too.
And psych ward is so much scarier than jail by levels of magnitude, except for the rape scare of jail, sure, which is probably overblown a little bit. I don't know. I hope I never have to find out. But
it's real in prison.
Yeah.
The difference between jail and prison. In prison, that's a real.
Yeah. So, but the problem is with psych wards is that there's no, you aren't sentenced. They're not you're going to have this 7 days in here to chill out, or what. I didn't know if I was in there forever. Oh. I didn't know first off, it only confirmed my paranoia that people were after me, and that I was going to be institutionalized or imprisoned in some way, and then it was also just a strange Wizard of Oz kind of scenario where there was people in there that were crazy versions of people that I knew. And so it was really messing with my sense of reality, because I also kind of had these ideas that there's a number of us connected at any one time, seven people in your life that you're connected to, but then there's all these different circles of 7 or 9 people or whatever it might be. And so then I got in there, and each one of these people one guy reminded me of this a guy that I see in my DMT trips sometimes too, and he was oddly guiding me through things, but also being a little abrasive too, which is what this guy in this DMT space is and so that was freaking me out. And so then part of
that's intense.
I didn't know. There was weird stuff too, trying to use the phones to call out. You'd hear them listening in on you, or there'd be another phone that someone else would use, and it was just, I think it was just old phones that they have in there, and the wiring's bad or something. But you'd hear other things happening. You'd hear whatever communication from someone else in another unit of the psych ward or whatever talking on the phone.
Yeah.
And so it was just there's so many things, and then you're forced to take, just go along with whatever they say, which is taking medication.
And you're forced to take the meds. You've got to take the meds.
As far as I could tell.
Yeah. If that's part of the deal.
Yeah. Right. And, you want to be a good boy and do all the things just to get out of here and try to act normal. And then, they keep you really busy with all these meetings and stuff. Oh, wow. And those seemed it was like kindergarten or something. I guess it's because, you know, they kind of need to cater to, you know, the least functional people. You know, there's people with you know, mental retardation and stuff as well in there. So it's just a little bit. So that I'm sitting there and I'm like, and I'm like, am I being made fun of right now, or like what is this, or is this like a kindergarten? Yeah, and
right. Wow, that's really intense. What an intense experience to have, especially when you're like knee deep in sort of the self-actualized sort of introspection that psychedelics give you.
Yeah.
And that you do, and then you sort of take this little detour, and it kind of like, wow.
It was mostly had whatever never like triggered the paranoia. I was getting weird and I was getting out there. And some of my ideas were like a bit much. For, say, like my girlfriend to have to listen to for 4 hours at a time. But everything was kind of okay until like the paranoia, and a lot of it was as my girlfriend became more and more intensely worried, I became like more and more intensely like worried and paranoid, and I didn't know if she was like against me or it was kind of a nightmare.
I think, I mean, the overuse, I mean, psychedelics, they're just like really all drugs. I mean, the overuse, I mean, I'm a recovering substance abuse user of harder drugs. And at the peak of my, I guess, bottom was my fear that I wasn't going to come back mentally. I mean, I knew like the drugs would wear off and everything, but I thought like maybe at some point, like something could snap. Like I could see also via my visits to institutions and stuff, you could see other people who have snapped for whatever reason, you know, not necessarily from drugs, just mental health in general. And that is, it really makes you question and get in touch with the very nature of reality in the first place, right? What is this thing that we call being together and being functional, you know? And I really think about that on psychedelics a lot. Like we all are sort of forced to confine, to act and behave within these walls of life. We got to pay rent, we got to have insurance, we got to put gas in the car, we got to spill coffee on people's couches and shit. But you know, you
have to spill coffee.
You have to spill coffee.
That was I didn't spill coffee on your couch. The universe
did
spilled coffee on your couch.
But it makes me think like these people who do have severe mental illness, maybe they're the ones who've got it all figured out.
Yeah, I mean, they might be accessing, let's even say, some region of the brain where it's just like the data's a little more raw and a little more like the math is a little more clear or something, and that they're able to articulate, and maybe they don't even know what they are articulating, or they're having a hard time processing it because it is so overwhelming. I know in my experience, what I felt was that everything had more significance and more meaning behind it. And, you know, and I was going through, I'm big into cognitive biases, and, you know, I have a science podcast, Here We Are, and cognitive biases are like one of my favorite things to think about. So I'm like, you know, this is a epiphania. We tend to project too much meaning on things. We tend to perceive more patterns than there actually are. We err toward pattern recognition. And then we have these confirmation biases, and you know, you think like owl means something significant. Now you start seeing like owls more places in art and on the walls, and there were always the same number of owls in like restaurant paintings or whatever, but now they really stick out to you and become part of your conscious awareness. And I was kind of like logically running my crazy brain through like there was two of me in there like arguing, and the crazier part was just very deep, like very emotional, like very, this is like there are pressing issues, and you've stumbled across some math of figuring out time travel, and like now there's people coming for you from the future to like stop you, prevent you from doing this and that. And then how do you stop time travelers from coming after you? And that's going. So that's one part of me is trying to stop time travelers, and another part of me is trying to be like, no, there's not time travelers coming after you. And like those two are fighting it out. Well, those two personalities are also fighting their own battles. But what was interesting was there was a lot of like raw and fairly accurate information, and it's just a lot of what our consciousness is doing is inhibiting the amount of data and sensory information coming in because we need to be able to focus on what's important in the moment. And this is, it just kind of shut off those limiters, or the what's the default mode network or whatever. And so I just felt like everything's so connected and meaningful, and it was what my brain was having a really hard time sorting out was like, it had no sense of priorities, and like it had no sense of like what information is important right now. Like is this conversation that we're having any more or less important than like these rocks, the patterns of the rocks on your wall right now? Like they seemed like equally valid sources of information to me, and that's where a lot of the confusion was.
Well, I mean, you make a very valid point about our restrictor mechanism for how much information that we can take in, and that's part of the great schism of the modern age, is that we, as a society, as a culture, we're taking in more information than any time ever in the history of mankind, and results unknown. Too early to tell. Well, we don't know what's going to happen, or how this is working, how this is going to mutate the evolutionary code, and what's going to happen, in generations from now.
I mean, as a culture, it looks like a psychological break.
It does. I mean, it looks like chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if we didn't have that sort of, this ability to sort of restrain ourselves and find a little peace to be able to go within, it would look like chaos. I mean, let's look at us. We're running around like madmen, all the time. And one of the great results of piercing the veil through the psychedelic experience is to be able to take note of that, right? To be able to actually see that and go, oh my God. And then how can I act differently? How can I maybe alter my life just a little bit differently to make sense of this mad world, right?
Yeah. I mean, because I go back and forth with that too, because part of me is, I have a couple different relationships with psychedelics, and a large part of my relationships with psychedelics, because mushrooms are probably my...
That's your go-to.
That's my go-to. It's my oldest, dearest friend.
You're eating them like candy in the Kentucky scene. The guy was like, you're just going to keep eating them. All right, here we go. No reckless abandon. It was awesome.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been eating mushrooms since I was 16 years old. Sure. So it's been like 21 years, and I've also, they've just always been so. The point I was going to make is like, when I do mushrooms, I'm more just like, oh, this is reality. I mean, not every aspect of it. I don't think anything is like, any one perception is reality, but there's something about mushrooms for me. I remember right away, like everyone else is like, you see these crazy cartoons and you're in a cartoon world or whatever. And I'm like, well, maybe for you, but I think maybe your imagination's running away with you a little bit, because for me, when I did mushrooms, and granted, I was doing lower doses, I think, back then too. 2 grams or something like that. I think 2 grams is a pretty standard dose. I think 4 grams was like a very large dose heroic. When I was young. And whereas now that doesn't, 4 grams doesn't seem like much to me at all. But I always thought, this is normal. Like, I've felt crazy my whole life. I felt like an alien. I felt like, I don't understand, is everyone nuts? Like, I just shut down my whole life. I'm like, I better not share any of my belief, because like, just like sitting in church and just watching people just like repeating these memorized words that they don't have any sense of the meaning to, because if you actually listen to any of them, they didn't really, either they didn't have meaning or they were just kind of like bizarre and silly, and like same with like a Pledge of Allegiance or or national, or like any of these kind of very robotic, controlling, like my whole life, that always was just like the creepiest thing to me and made me really, really, really uneasy. I remember like 5-6 years old, or just people like going crazy about the sport thing on the television. I nothing against sports. I hope people find happiness in church or sports or in anything that you can any bit of way that you can muster a bit of joy out of life. Absolutely. You go for it.
Yeah.
But it just like seemed like just this mindless following, and it always feels so condescending to talk like that. But the point is when I first did mushrooms and started experiencing mushrooms, and really it's been most of my relationship with them, I've just always felt like, okay, I wasn't crazy. This is an odd, crazy existence. And, a lot of people are just following along. I'm sure I'm just following along with things, and I'm sure I'm following along the contrarian path like a little robot as well, where you could tell me to do something and then I'll just very predictably do the opposite thing.
That's Bob Weir has one of my favorite sayings about that sort of behavior. He calls himself pathologically anti-authoritarian.
Right.
I love that.
And it is like, after a while, this is something in my, especially early mid 30s. I'm 38 now. So, fairly recent for me. Within the last 5-6 years, I've had to come to terms with like, well, I've kind of thought like I was above all of this stuff, but like, am I just playing along on a different game, that's just as rigid and just as predictable and silly and thoughtless? That might very well be the case. But so mushrooms have just always been like, oh, this is normal. This is what life is to me. And then DMT is just like, oh, I've been in the Matrix my whole life, but this is like now a totally different reality. So that's when I say I have 2 different relationships with psychedelics. That's kind of what I mean by that. One is that it just highlights what reality is, and then another one is like, what the fuck?
Unplugging.
Yeah.
Well, and I think from a very sort of basic, rudimentary, scientific point of view, you can make an argument that the experience on mushrooms, or the psychedelic of your choosing, is a glimpse into what reality really is. Because, look at it like, dogs and cats and all animals, how they can see and hear things that we can't. Their frequency spectrum is different than ours. So our frequency spectrum, if you could see all the microwaves and radio waves and light beams going in front of us right now, it would be blinded.
If we had 20 cones in our eyes, our experience of color would be drastically different, like it is for many females, especially compared to males that are only males are colorblind. And then some females have an extra cone in their eyes and are.
There you go. That's a great example. So psychedelics sort of just increase our frequency spectrum. Right. So you're really seeing.
Yeah, I've definitely seen colors within psychedelics that I've never seen in the real world. That's for sure.
And I've also experienced like all of us, experienced myself in ways that I have never experienced in the real world. You're able just to kind of view your own ego. And
one of my favorite and weirdest and fun, but this is just like a very good example of capturing. When I say like mushrooms make me feel like I'm seeing reality more, it's still within metaphors, but just the metaphors that mushrooms provide just seem more true to life than like whatever, like Goldilocks story or Little Red Road, whatever, like the moral of the story that children's books are trying to instill on you or whatever, like everything's a metaphor, right? And so the mushroom metaphor is like mushrooms connect me.
Oh, we have the smoothie
delivery.
Yay. We have Nicole bringing us smoothies right now. We're gonna pause the show. We'll be back in a second. We're back from the smoothie break with smoothies in hand.
So mushrooms really connect me with kind of, it's more like evolutionary. It's more like a connection with the whole of the human experience than it is like MDMA is more like deeply personal. And mushrooms are much more about like the human condition. And so I remember I went to go to a float tank on mushrooms, and you shower before getting in the tank. And I'm at the spa like facility or whatever, and I go in, I'm tripping, and it's it's my first time doing this on mushrooms, and I was just kind of like, the whole experience seemed just kind of silly to me, and I was kind of like, I'm by myself, and I'm like, what am I doing this for? Kind of. It was just like a general, that uneasiness that can come along with the upswing of a mushroom trip. So that's what I was experiencing, and I turn on the shower, and I start like rinsing myself off, and I look down and I just kind of see myself as this like hairy ape, and I'm just like, look at what a ridiculous like fancy monkey I am. There's like, I'm just this primate at this ridiculous spa, like doing this silly thing right now, and it just really struck a chord with how odd and interesting the human experience is, and like really, because it is hard to remind ourselves sometimes that we're primates, and mushrooms always reminds me of that in like an intensely clear way. So that's like a good example of like when I talk about like a clarity from mushrooms, like that's what I've like. Everyone seems like I just see us for the primates that we are. Like, I don't think I've ever had. I think I've attempted. I don't think I've ever had sex on mushrooms because of that.
I have.
Because I'm just like, we're just monkeys. This is weird. So weird.
Have you ever played with animals on mushrooms?
Oh yeah, but I love that.
That's wild. I've never looked at a monkey on mushrooms, but I've gone horseback riding. And it's really, it's very, very similar to that. I mean, not necessarily the reinforcement of the primate thing, but you really do get like the shared genetic code.
Yeah.
Like, oh, fuck, man.
Yeah.
Like, we're not that far apart.
Yeah, right.
It's pretty.
I'm riding myself.
Why am I listening? I'm allowing myself to be kicked and pulled. What the fuck is going on, man?
Yeah.
But I did want to ask, because I watched your movie, and you're from La Crosse, Wisconsin, and you said you've been doing mushrooms since you were 16. But I mean, that was a long time ago. I mean, I just started doing psychedelics around the same time, and it's hard for me to look back now on like what I was like before and what I was like after. It was so long ago now when we were young, and right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's like Shane before mushrooms. Like, I don't even have a sense of like
have a sense of that anymore, right?
Who I would be or anything with that. Yeah.
But what was like the deep-seated inspiration to go as far as to make a movie about this? Because not everybody does this, you know, and you did.
Well, that's why I
love that.
I know these I mean, I think I can't tell. Like, I'm a pretty harsh critic of myself, and so I have a hard time telling like if anything that I make is like good or not. Like, I always have a sense of how I can make it better, and I always have a sense of like things that I don't like, but I can't tell like overall. And the way that I know that I have a better sense that this and say my tour are good is just because of like the ease in which they came together. This wasn't like me looking for a hook or something like that. It just fell
together.
All that happened,
yeah.
Like the history of all of this is like I was a closet. I wasn't a closet psychedelic user, but because I always had like 3 to 5 minutes about psychedelics in my act.
That's always been a part of your set.
Yeah, and my first album has a joke about mushrooms, but even if you listen to that, it's very silly, and it's just like, it's more just like the things that crowds will laugh at is like, I did mushrooms and then like saw a dinosaur, whoa, you know, and it's not, you know, talking about what these things actually do and what they mean to us. That's in the sense where I was a bit closeted, and I also have my science podcast that I was like very protective of. You know, it's not that old. I haven't been doing that podcast for only like 4 years now, but I didn't ever have a psychedelic researcher on there, as it was already hard enough for me to get guests because they're like, a comedian, is he gonna be making fun of me, or you know what's going on, and so I didn't want to be labeled like some druggie or whatever. And so all that happened was I went on Pete Holmes' You Made It Weird podcast years ago, and to share a story. I just put out an album about breaking my feet while hiking, and so Pete asked me like, where'd you break your feet? I was like, I was in Sedona, Arizona. What were you doing in Sedona? I was going there to do ayahuasca for the first time. I didn't get to because I broke my feet before that happened. What's ayahuasca? Well, there's this stuff DMT that I smoke. What's DMT? And I started telling him about DMT, and he's like, whoa, what? And then like that just turned into the whole episode. And then at the time, we happened to have the same agent. My agent heard us talking, and she's like, what was that DMT stuff? And like, I was worried she was going to be like, I can't be with I can't have a client that's a crazy druggy weirdo talking about aliens, but that wasn't what happened. She was like, that was the most fascinating thing I've ever heard about. And I was like love it. I was very reluctant to, I never really pictured myself talking about DMT on stage, because that's just, it's out there.
It's out there. And not only out there, it's hard to talk about.
It is.
Because it's so out there.
Yes. And so I was like, well, you know, just because our relationship was fairly new, and I was like, just so you know, I like doing themed shows, and I do plan on eventually doing a show about psychedelics. I've been sitting on all this material that I've written over years. It's just that I figure I need to wait till I'm a little more established of it. Yeah, I've done like late night and done a couple like a Comedy Central half-hour special. I had a Netflix special for an hour, but I'm not like a name act, and I can't like draw a bunch of. Once once you can like put your name on a marquee at a comedy club and you'll fill that room based on your name, then you can kind of talk about whatever you want to talk about, and it doesn't matter.
Right.
And I'm still not anywhere near that level. And so I was like, I need to be at that level first. Then I'll do a show about psychedelics as well. That will be like one of the many topics. And she's like, I think you should try it now. Did this indie show. We put together a couple indie shows. Went great. You know, there's to the 30 people that showed up or whatever early on. You know, just this will be a fun experiment. I've never talked about psychedelics for an hour, and I'm sick of performing to bachelor and bachelorette parties. So this will be fun. And then the response was so great that I was like, wow, if I could figure out how to market this thing. Took me a year to figure out how to kind of fill a room with it. And then once I did that, started putting together the tour. And I was like, well, now it makes sense to out myself. Not that I never mentioned psychedelics or anything, but I was pretty guarded about it on my podcast. And that's when I reached out to Maps, because I was like, I don't want someone like me that's just like smoking DMT, journaling about it, and calling it science. like I wanted someone like really legitimate, and I was able to get a hold of Brad Burge, and I remember like, you know, going back and forth in emails and having, you know, they weren't just like all in right away or whatever. They investigated like who I was and and Brad and I had a long conversation on the phone, and me trying to convince, like, no, I'm not like making fun of you guys or anything. Like, I'm genuinely interested. I care about science. And, you know, then had a couple of, I think Cole Marto was my first ever guest talking about psychedelic research.
I did a podcast with him last week.
And then, you know, I did another one when I was doing the show in San Francisco, and a bunch of Maps people came out, saw the show, loved it, heard I was putting together a tour, wanted to do like a cross-promotional thing. They promote me and their email list and whatnot, and I you know, plug them and have like brochures and stuff on the merch table afterwards. And that's how all that came together, and what ended up being on a 111 city tour. Well, then I was putting together this tour. At first it's going to be 40 cities, 50 cities, 60 cities. It's already insanely large tour for any comic. So much so that the more cities I added, the bigger a deal it was. So then I'm like getting on you know, Joe Rogan for the first time, and Mark Maron's podcast, and, you know, getting back on Pete Holmes and Duncan Trussell's podcast, and I just like doing all the top podcasts promoting this tour. And this producer who normally does stand-up specials and has filmed some like pilots for Comedy Central and whatnot, but this guy Matt Schuler just wanted to make a documentary that was also had a comedian in it, and heard me talking on Mark Maron's podcast WTF, reached out to me, and I was pretty busy at the time. I think I just was like, I'm too busy for anything right now. And at first he's like, you want to make like a scripted movie? You want to like, you're just like, I'm just interested in exploring ideas with you. And I was kind of, I think we'd even probably talked about, like, I'm sure I told him my love of cognitive biases and like how to maybe explore that.
How did I didn't listen to that podcast. Just not to derail him. Just curious, how did Mark Maron respond to it?
Mark was one of my favorite ones that I did promoting it. Yeah. He was, as someone, he's an outsider. He's not in the world of psychedelics. Yeah. He was a really great interview. He was one of my favorite ones. It was also interesting because his unlike, say, Duncan Trussell, who, you know, his audience is like It's familiar.
It's us, yeah.
Yeah.
And Rogan too, to some extent.
And Rogan too. Maron's audience, I'm sure for many of them, it might have been the first time hearing psychedelics talked about in this way.
That's why I asked.
And so that was interesting. And then and so I was like, well, in passing, I was just like, it's too bad you didn't get a hold of me a little sooner, because in 3 weeks or something, or next month, I'm actually going to be at the Psychedelic Science Conference. It's the biggest one in the world. It only happens once every 4 years. It'd be this great opportunity to get all these researchers. And he's like, I know I can put that together. Let's go and shoot that. And so we went there and shot a bunch of researchers. That was when we came in. I'm so sorry that you didn't make the film.
Oh,
but
my God.
When we did, the reason and we came here, as you saw, we ended up using the same kind of standard format for the interview all throughout.
Yeah.
And it was all the stuff that we shot at the conference. So you were unfortunately our guinea pig, because you were the very first thing that we ever shot for the documentary, which is going to make for some nice little bonus footage and stuff.
B-roll.
And you'll be in the second. You'll be in Psychonautics too, and
or the Blu-ray extras maybe.
Yeah, you'll be in the extras for sure.
Yeah, I noticed that, and I was like, oh yeah, we shot in my living room. That's not the same background.
Yeah. So it was just we didn't know what the film was or anything at that time.
Yeah.
So that's how that came together. Like both the psychedelic show, the tour and the documentary, and now this potential docu-series that I can't say a whole lot about, but is kind of in the works, maybe pitching, and probably nothing will come of it, but it's got some big people behind it and whatnot.
Amazing.
Is all of that just came together very, very naturally. Sometimes people are like, because people in the comedy community are just like, oh, you just like found this hook and you became the psychedelic comedian? I'm like, well, that's not quite. It was just like, I didn't mean for that. I remember having a conversation because I hadn't met Rick, even though Maps was like, me and Maps were working together. And Rick came to my show when I came through in Boston.
Oh, right.
And he even saw me on stage. Like, I used to say in my act, I was like, this is like one of my many interests. Like, I'm not like, I don't plan on like living my life as like the psychedelic guy or whatever. Right. And I remember Rick talking to me the next day and being like, so you're like, it seemed like you're kind of worried about being pigeonholed or whatever as a psychedelic comedian or something, and I was like, yeah, it's been a concern of mine, and I love my podcast as it is, right? I don't want it to turn into a psychedelic podcast. Not that psychedelic podcasts are great, but I don't want mine to be that, and it annoys me sometimes when people are like, oh, this guy has a psychedelic podcast. I'm like, well, 10 episodes out of 170 episodes have been.
That's why I have 2.
Yeah.
So I don't fall into that.
Right.
I know.
And so anyhow, but Rick was just like, he's like, well, anything anything in the realm of psychedelics that you do want to, like, anything that we can do to help you or whatever, you let us know, and we're here to help because we're fans of what you're doing.
Very cool.
And that was just like such a night. There was no ever like pressure to like be a spokesperson for drugs or anything, but it just all kind of happened. So all this happened very naturally.
In a lot of ways, so that is, the best thing that can happen to the psychedelic movement, because the psychedelic movement as a whole, and I say this with the most love and admiration, especially given where I come from, it's been sort of insular. People who are psychedelic cheerleaders, that is their life. They are psychedelicists, That's all they do. They are zealots and wide-eyed and passionate, and that's great. Very, very necessary. But in order for the movement to expand and gain mainstream acceptance and legitimacy, it takes outsiders, kind of detouring a little bit, like, you're doing, and Michael Pollan.
Michael Pollan is,
it's been a big,
I heard Kanye West is rapping about psychedelics now. Yeah. I mean, I hate Kanye.
Yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say that I hate his music, because I haven't really heard much of it other than what's on the radio, which
some of his early albums are great.
Yeah, but I heard just the other day, I was like, I wonder, I'll just play his first album to like hear and I get how it was like very empowering and that's why it's like such a contrast from where he is now, which is just like everything, and the embodiment of everything that's wrong with our country went from like.
And Rogan too. I mean, that's a big part of like the Rogan bump with the psychedelic movement is like that's not all he does. He really does, So
yeah, I mean, Rogan to get like a bunch of meatheads into psychedelics, that is like world changing.
That takes work.
Yeah.
It takes finesse. It takes fucking finesse, man.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, I mean, I think, but all of this combined with what you're doing and all of these names we just talked about, like we are living in the new golden age of psychedelic legitimacy. It's amazing. I can't believe it.
Yeah, I mean, and part of me is like, sometimes I'm almost frustrated by it in certain ways, because just my personality is like, when I look at the 60s and the counterculture movement, like that's really exciting to me. And that's not what, and so it's exciting that now this new movement has a lot of legitimacy behind it, but then part of me feels a little icky about like the, Silicon Valley like we can do psychedelics and be more efficient. Yeah, right. Like, I'm like, oh, come on, that's not what. And like the blatant lack of minorities within the psychedelic movement, I find like discouraging, just because it's like, it's supposed to be like, this is like the fighting for your rights, people. This is like the counterculture. Like, I thought these things would go hand in hand with the gay movement and Black Lives Matters and everything else. I would think like the psychedelics would go along with that, but that hasn't been the case.
More integration on that than now, for sure.
By a long shot. So that's something that I think, I don't know how that happens. I don't know if it's going to be through music again or something like that, how that'll come together. Well, but that's a piece that's missing.
And I tell you what my take on that is, of course, the research and the science that is going into psychedelics right now, amazing, brilliant, don't stop, everybody keep doing what they're doing.
Right.
But Johns Hopkins, NYU, institutions like that, those are white elitist institutions.
Right.
Just saying that we're in the midst of this peak of scientific, legitimate, FDA sponsored research, that is, by its very definition,
white
elitism kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So the cognitive liberty discussion and the social discussion needs to be brought back onto the forefront, so we can once again integrate.
Right.
It doesn't become this like uptight stuff.
Because otherwise it's going to be hard to reach. Like, hey, black people, we have some experiments we'd like to do on you with these drugs with uncertain event. Like, that's going to be
that's going to backfire. That's not going to work out.
Right. So that's something that this era doesn't have, that the 60s did have, because in many ways this era has just a bigger and stronger kind of more stable background and more generations, more age groups involved, and I, me being a science guy, I love seeing the hard science and the data and the tests and all. I love it.
Yeah, me too.
But me being a rebel, I want to see some of the counterculture stuff.
Me too.
Mix a little more.
Me too. Well, so your film, your Psychonautics, you're looking for distribution. So in the meantime, if people want to see it, what's the plan? What can we say to our listeners here? Stay tuned.
Yeah. Hold your breath. I will say, do hold your breath, because it won't be long.
Okay.
And it's coming. It's just, even when we get distribution, which now we'll get distribute. It's like, we put the thing out on YouTube if we had to, but that's not going to be the case. And now, especially that we, won an award in a respected enough festival.
Yeah.
That hopefully it's going to be. I would love to see it on a streaming platform. I can't mention names of what I would like to see and everything else, but I would love to see it on a streaming platform where everyone can see it and show it to their friends and whatnot. But rather than we might sometimes you get more money because some independent place wants to get, CISO was a company for a while that was throwing a bunch of money into the comedy biz. I don't know if you ever heard of CISO. They tried to be the next Comedy Central. Oh. And so then you had to subscribe to CISO to watch a Doug Stanhope special or something like that. And so I'm hoping we don't get into something like that where we get a bunch of money thrown at us by some startup where it's people don't. I'm hoping it's something that people already have, so they can just hit play and it's real easy peasy. That's awesome. That's the hope. Fingers crossed. We'll see. But Shane Mauss, MAUSS.com to see my tour dates and whatnot, which will be continuing to update, and then my podcast, Here We Are Podcast.com, 170 different episodes, big into, especially early on, evolutionary psychology and biology was kind of the foundation that we built early on, and now expand into a lot of neuroscience, animal behavior, sociology, all kind of life science stuff that hopefully you hear these little studies that might actually improve your life or explain some things that affect you.
And get you learned, if nothing else.
Exactly.
Thanks, Shane, for coming.
Thank you.